I've escaped from my studio. I'm on the Greek island of Crete, enjoying the sunshine at the latest ACO tournament. And I think you might just be able to see the waves in the bay behind me. It's rather glorious here, I'm telling you. In my last masterclass for patrons, I was looking at some strategic ideas and focusing on the games of Zalo Flohr. Flohr was one of the strongest players in the world in the 1930s, and I looked at a few of his games where he outplayed his opponents in quite a similar way. It was uncanny, actually, the similarities. There was one particular endgame, a classic, that I rather rushed through to squeeze into my program. So I'd like to go through it again now in detail to complete my lecture properly. And for those of you who aren't patrons, you get to see a classic endgame. Remember, to become a patron, it's just $25 per month, and you can get a discount if you subscribe for a whole year. Without further ado, here is Flohr against Vidmar from the famous Nottingham tournament 1936. This is the start of the rook and pawn endgame. You can see that black has these weaknesses on c6 and a6, but black is very solid here. First things first, you have to bring the king into the center, and black does the same. So black's king has reached this excellent central square, and white's rook attacks the weakness on a6. So black defends with rook a8. Now it's very important that white prevents this pawn advancing from advancing to c5, so therefore king d4. So the king takes its position in the middle of the board, very nice, and it's slightly further up the board than black's king, so that's important. Now, to make progress in such positions, it's usually done step by step. Now it's black's move, but black already has to be aware of what white is trying to do. It's clear that white can't break through on the queen side, so white needs to do something on the other side of the board. I mean, if it were white's move, I would play g4 here, and that's a very nice theme that I've often spoken about, where this one pawn cramps these three pawns, and that white starts to gain space on the king side. So Vidmar plays f5. Good move, basically preventing or discouraging that move g4. It just wouldn't have the same effect now. So Flohr decides to gain space on the queen side, b4. That's very nice. So that basically really emphasizes white's control over the c5 and a5 squares. Now I'm going to come back later and talk about improvements for black. I'd like to sort of flow through the game first. So rook b8. Well, if rook takes pawn, then rook takes pawn check, and black has broken free. So a3, of course, you just keep the position absolutely secure. And the rook came back to a8. Now, what next for white? This is the thing. I mean, white has reached, a certain point, but you can't really go further here. I mean, I would like to exploit this pin and play a4 and b5, but that's not working. So here, for example, and then rook b8, and again, rook takes pawn check is fine for black. And if the king steps back, then rook b6, and, well, I don't think white is going to make progress there because the king is now tied to the defense of that b pawn. So let's go back. So not a4. So how should white make progress here? Well, as I mentioned before, white really needs to make progress on the king side. I mean, I guess you could play something like h4. That's possible. But instead, Flohr decided to play e4. So breaking open the position, and the whole point of this is to make room for the king to reach the king side. If the king can reach that pawn, that's good news. And you can see that the rook is perfectly placed on the 5th rank, so still tying black's rook down to defending a6, controlling c5 as well. And again, I'll come back to this position and look for improvements. But rook a7 played, and the king comes over. So now white's threat is obvious. If the king reaches h6, then black is in massive trouble. So for example, if black continues to wait, then the king comes in, king h6, and then before transferring the rook, you can play g4, h5, get a pawn on h5, and then be an easy task for that rook to switch round to attack h7. So that's what black has to prevent. Okay, what about rook f7 check? Because if the king goes up, then rook f2. Well, in this case, the king can play to g4. And actually, the rook just has to switch back to defending the a pawn, because if rook f2, king g3, rook a6, and white has won a pawn for nothing really. So that's why h6 was played. Best move. Okay, what next for white? So the direct plan to bring the king in to attack the h-pawn hasn't worked. So what do you do next? Time to gain some space. h4. And black can only wait here. King e6. King g4. Rook a8. Black is waiting. And h5. So in this way, white is still trying to get through to that h6 pawn. So for example, if pawn takes pawn check, the king comes in, so this is attacked, h6 is attacked. If rook g8, then g4, and well, 2 pawns are on prise now, so the rook will, if the rook switches back to a8, then simply king takes pawn. So be a mistake to allow the king in, and that's why Vidmar played g5. Yeah, if king f6, trying to block the king out. In fact, this was suggested on the broadcast, and I can't remember. I was in a hurry and didn't come up with a very good antidote to this move. But actually, it's quite simple. Rook c5, and this applies to other positions where the king wanders across. So now the king can't defend the pawn. So rook c8, and then a4. So this tried and tested method, a4 and b5, exploiting the pin, and black has no way out. I think the crucial thing here is that if the rook switches to attack the b pawn, then rook takes pawn follows with check. That's vital. So there's really no defense to that. Okay, so that was king f6. Let's go back. So g5 was played, but Flohr has achieved something here, because that pawn on h5, very, very useful. fixing the pawn on h6. So you could say now there are two weaknesses that white is going for. There's obviously the pawn on a6, and black is tied down to that, but white would like to get through to the pawn on h6 as well. So let's see how Flohr did that. So first of all, the careful move, g3. The king could transfer straight away, but after the check, well, after king e4 you don't want to allow rook f4 check. So that's why g3 was played. It's just a tidy move. But in this kind of position, black really can't do anything at all. So Vidmar is still waiting, rook a7. Now the king transfers. Black waits, king e4. Black waits. And now there's some repetition. King d4 threatening to move into c5, and here of course the king blocks out. Flohr comes back again, threatening to come in here, and the king comes back. So no progress, but okay, it certainly doesn't harm white's chances just by repeating the position. In some ways it clarifies the objectives. And now there's a very nice move. So white play, I think time for a think and drink moment here. Cheers. Rook e5 check is a very uncomfortable move for black because the king has to choose which side to go. If king f6, well, we've already seen this actually, rook c5, and once again a4 is very powerful, it's a winning move. So king d6 was played, and now rook e8. So the rook makes the break into the position, and the wonderful thing about having that pawn on h5 is that once the pawn on h6 drops, then of course that h-pawn is very close to the queening square, so any race white is just going to win easily. And well, there's a few things to note here. Okay, so a5 rook h8, it's winning. Of course you always have to look at the pawn endgame, but because white's king is simply further up the board, this is very easy. If the king goes this way, then the king squeezes in and gets the h-pawn, and if the king goes this way, then the king wraps up with king d6 and king takes c6. So Vidmar played c5, but rook check. If the king goes back, then that's winning. The king is very awkwardly placed there. Vidmar played king c6, and Flohr simply checked and tied it up, just took the c-pawn and clear pawn up, and still has the deadly threat to invade with the king. And the game finished like this. And the king came in. And at this point, Vidmar resigned. Well, I mean, that was a very smooth win by Flohr, and this has always been held to be a classic rook and pawn endgame, and it is. I mean, Flohr, typically for him, showed wonderful technique. But let's have a look and see how black could defend this better. I mean, it's very hard to defend these positions when you're under pressure, but there were improvements. So let's go back right to the beginning. So in this position, after b4, in fact, well, Levenfish and Smyslov pointed out that king c7 is possibly a better defense. So the king simply wants to come to b6, and then the rook will be free to put a little bit of pressure here, and that sort of pegs white back. So king c5 looks very impressive, but black has chances to defend this. And white can still play there, but that's one possible defense. Okay, let's go further on in the game, because there were other chances. So this is after the break. Even here, black has chances to defend. I mean, again, king c7 is possible to play king b6 and then to free the rook. And if king f4, check. Now if king g5, then the rook comes down here, so the king has to hesitate with the plan with king g4, and then king b6, and again black has better chances than in the game. Even here in this position, although this looks absolutely fantastic for white, I mean, Flohr's play was very, very impressive. But in this position, instead of g5, after g5 it's certainly lost. But a better chance would have been rook g8. Now this does give up a pawn, but there's a little bit of pressure here. So for example, h takes g6, rook takes. So the king has to defend the g pawn. Black's king comes back, and rook takes a6. So white is a pawn up, but because the king isn't so active, then black actually has pretty decent drawing chances here. I mean, there's still a long way to go, but with the active rook, then black has much better chances than in the game where, yeah, the rook remained passive the whole time. I think that's basically the key to the defense in this position, actually. I mean, in so many occasions, the question is, can black actually activate the rook? And yeah, just coming back to those positions right way back when it was possible to play, for example, king c7 and bring the king to b6 to activate the rook, and that was the theme in several positions basically. So that would have been better. Nevertheless, it is an absolute classic, and Flohr once again showed how to squeeze when you have a positional advantage absolutely beautifully.